So thank you so much for joining us today in the webinar on how we can look to manage your finances as we deal with the coronavirus. A little bit of background about the pandemic and how it relates to other similar disruptions that we've experienced in the past, and then a little bit about how individuals like you and I are able to deal with the pandemic from a financial perspective. So wanted to give you a quick status about where we stand. So we've done one of these webinars about, I would say, 5 or 6 weeks ago, and things have moved rather dramatically since then. India is now on the list of countries that are affected, and affected in a fairly meaningful way. But there are certain interesting aspects to this. One, of course, worldwide, about 5 million people are confirmed as infected by the virus, and India is about 118,000 at this point. A few interesting things. One, of course, is that if you look at it as a cases per million, then compared to many of the numbers above us on this board, you can see that India is only at about 87. The pessimist would say, give us some time, and then we'll get higher up. But frankly, so far, I would say compared to many other countries, we've sort of gotten off to a reasonably good start in terms of how we've been able to deal with this. The interesting thing to see is that China's numbers are even less, but I guess the good news about looking at that is that China has been able to get this under control, put it behind them, and move on. The same number, if you look at cases per million, when you look across the world, the other interesting thing that leaps out is the darker blue ends up sort of further closer to the poles, and if you look at the equator is generally sort of running through here, then you see that countries close to the equator or around the equator don't seem to be so badly affected so far. So it is possible that India might have a lighter version of the virus. Fingers crossed. I think the lockdown has helped in creating a much more manageable situation for us. But I do have to confess upfront that, I, along with many other people who are talking about the virus every day, we are not experts in this. And we'll have to figure out how the rest of the journey unwinds. So pretty much for the rest of the presentation today, I'm not really going to be talking much about the virus itself, but more about how we as individuals will be able to deal with it and deal with its consequences purely from a financial perspective. Most of our investments are through financial markets, whether it be debt investments or equity investments. And generally speaking, financial markets hate uncertainty. And uncertainty pretty much describes where we find ourselves right now. The things that we don't know at this point are quite significant and will have a significant bearing in terms of how all this unfolds. When will a vaccine be found? How much longer before the cases peak, before we start to say we are behind the worst and from now on things will only get better? And once we've done that, how long will it be before we get back to life as usual and business as usual? So these are very important questions, and unfortunately the answer to none of those questions is really known today. If you look at the vaccines, there are about 8 contenders, interestingly 4 of them from China, all of whom are building vaccines that show promise, but none of them are proven yet and available commercially. These vaccines are now in various stages of testing and trials. As far as positive indications go, though, other countries, like I said, China, for instance, has put the virus behind them and moved on. They're opening factories, life is getting back to normal. Some of the vaccines, like I mentioned, are starting to show promise. And we seem to be slightly better off than many other countries around the world, possibly because of the warm weather, possibly because as a population, we've had either inoculations done when we were growing up, or because we've had some level of exposure to dengue and other illnesses like that. So our natural immunity may be higher. And finally, the government got off to a probably the strongest starting point compared to any other country around the world in terms of the severity of the lockdown. Of course, now the lockdown perhaps was easier than the opening up post the lockdown, which is really what we will encounter going forward. But there are some comparables, and I want to talk to you about this from a financial markets perspective. So if you look at previous outbreaks that we've had, and I want to caution all of you by starting out by saying that we have not experienced in our lifetime anything as severe as the coronavirus. So we've had SARS and bird flu and Ebola and Zika. It is quite possible that as an order of magnitude, the coronavirus is substantially higher in terms of the scale, scope, and impact compared to many of the other ones that you're looking at here. But there are perhaps some parallels that are worth drawing, which is that how does the financial market move when something like this happens? In particular, in all of these cases, we've looked at the Sensex, and in all of these cases, the markets start to correct quite sharply as soon as there is a fear that there may be a disruption to life and business. And it falls quite quickly and then reaches the bottom and then starts to climb off from the bottom. Now, the markets don't start falling as soon as the virus or epidemic has reached full proportion. It starts falling as soon as there is a concern or threat that something like that might happen. We all, I guess, want to know when the bottom may be, and the bottom, I think, in every case in the past has been one where the markets have bottomed out as soon as the fear fades, control is tangible, and hope starts to emerge. So broadly speaking, that is the time where the bottom will be found. Whether it is a question of viruses, whether it is vaccines, whether it is a question of cases plateauing out, and now we are on the path of recovery. And the reason why that happens, the reason why we don't wait until the last person is cured, is because the market is full of opportunists. So everyone is out there looking to make money, and everyone is out there looking to make more money than their neighbor, the other investor. So in such an environment, which is a very competitive, very intense place, people don't wait until the good news actually pans out or the bad news actually pans out. As soon as there is a thought that something like this will happen in the future, people react today. In the same way, we will not wait for everybody to get cured before the market starts to come off its bottom. We will wait only until we feel like the recovery is visible, and then immediately the markets will start climbing off from there. This is all just to explain how financial markets think and work. We still don't know, if you like, whether we are here or here or here in terms of where we are relative to the bottom. We had a very sharp correction where we went from, say, 42,000 in the Sensex all the way to 26,000. And since then, we've come off that and we've been hovering anywhere from 30,000 to 34,000. I suspect that until there is greater clarity about the path forward, whether it is vaccines or peaking of the virus or anything like that, we will hover around these levels and then gradually sort of recover from there and head on northwards. There was a hope in the beginning that the correction was very sharp, so the recovery will also be very sharp. It doesn't look like that's going to pan out. It looks like the recovery will be more U-shaped because the impact on business in the short term is likely to be felt. People will have to overcome their fear about contracting the virus and normalizing their behavior, normalizing their activities. And then, we are likely to start to see business recovery and markets recovery as well. Again, in all of these things, history is a great teacher. It's useful to see how the markets have dealt with previous episodes that were disruptive in nature. So if you look at this graph here, and apologies that it's so busy as it is, there's quite a lot of information here across all the way from 2073 until now. And across this entire period, there have been several things that have caused the markets to be meaningfully disrupted. Perhaps the most significant of them all from our recent memory has been the global financial crisis. And it is often being compared to what we are going through right now. And broadly speaking, if you look at episodes like this, what this graph shows is how significant was the correction from the top to the bottom, and how long did it take for us to recover. And if you look at the global financial crisis, that was the biggest one in our living memory, because the correction was almost 60%, and it took nearly 3 years for us to come off from there and get back to where we were before. So it was a very meaningful disruption, and it was very meaningful because the disruption was not an episodic one like SARS or MERS, which disrupts while it is there, and after that it's completely gone and there is no lasting effect. With the global financial crisis, you had regulators stepping in, you had the way companies behave changed, the way people interacted with financial markets change, and it was truly a global phenomenon in that it started in the US, but then institutions collapsed all across the world. So from that perspective, from a financial markets perspective, that was the most disruptive thing. If you were to look at 3 different types of things that can disrupt the markets, and this was a study done principally around the US over a long period of time, Goldman Sachs has classified disruptions in 3 ways. One is structural disruptions, one is cyclical disruptions, and the third is event-driven disruptions. So what we have now with the virus is an event-driven disruption. So basically, it is something that comes, creates a disruption, but once we are behind it, hopefully there won't be lasting effects. And that has been true to describe all the previous virus episodes that I've shown you, whether it be SARS or MERS. When it was there, it was pretty troublesome, but once it is dealt with and once it's behind us, then life goes on as usual, businesses go on as usual. And if you were to classify the coronavirus as an event-driven virus, which is probably the most apt description, the characteristics of an event-driven disruption is that the declines tend to be less sharp, the duration for which it lasts tends to be quite low, and then the time it takes to recover from that compared to a structural disruption like the global financial crisis is also quite low. So it is quite troublesome for us to go through this phase, but I think the hope that we have is that once we put it behind us, then us getting back to life as usual, business as usual will not take that long compared to other disruptions that we've encountered in the past. Now, if you look at this slide here, I think the important thing to realize is that not all countries will go through this episode in an identical fashion. Some countries will be extremely badly hit, some countries will be less badly hit, and some countries will actually potentially even benefit from such a thing. Now, what is the India story in this case? I think if you were to look at the India story, one of the factors is that because of the significant slowdown in business activity as a result of the virus episode, the consumption of crude oil has fallen, and as a result, the crude oil prices have fallen sharply. Now, this is a very significant thing from India's perspective because India imports 87% of its crude oil consumption. It is the 4th largest importer of crude oil in the world, and when we don't have to import as much crude oil, or the crude oil we are able to import costs us a lot less, as it is true now, we tend to save quite a lot of money. So that is one benefit that we get as a country because of the fall in crude oil prices. Our balance of payments improves substantially, and so that is one factor why India may actually come out looking not too bad as a result of this episode. The second one is that global supply chains hitherto have been very tightly integrated with China. And now suddenly countries all across the world who are manufacturing countries are starting to look at their supply chains and inspect it carefully to figure out how they can de-risk themselves from this extent of getting hardwired to China. There's this case of a German auto manufacturer who had to pretty much stop their supply chains, who had to pretty much stop their assembly line because they were importing from China a pigment which was used in the painting of their cars, really to give it that final glossy shine. And this pigment was being manufactured in Wuhan. And because of the disruptions to the global supply chain, what happened was that this was no longer available, and they couldn't afford to send their premier luxury cars out onto the streets looking half done. So it's things like this that really cause a disruption to companies' supply chains, and now they start looking at alternatives. How well we are able to benefit from this depends a little bit on how well we play our cards, but it is possible that as companies exit partially or wholly from China as a manufacturing destination, some of that flows may come to India, and that will benefit us as well. So that was by way of a little bit of context about the virus. Now let's look at what does this translate into for us, the individual or family that is an investor. Broadly speaking, we've been talking extensively to our customers as we go through this phase, and you can classify them into these three categories. You have people who, as a result of what is happening, are quite distressed. You have the other category, which is calm, who are able to deal with whatever is happening with a sense of, this too shall pass, if you like. And then you have the third category, which is those who are opportunistic, who really see that, behind every dark cloud, there is a silver lining. And we are experiencing kind of all three of them. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time describing each one, so you may be able to associate yourself, if you like, with one or more of these categories. And I'll also spend a little bit of time talking to you about, how you may be able to deal with the situation depending on which camp you're in. The worst hit are people who are in a situation not through their frame of mind, but mainly because of where they find themselves in their journey through life. If you think of a person or a family who has major cash outflows planned, such as maybe sending a child to college or already having made a down payment on a house or something like that, they've made a certain commitment, they have significant meaningful cash flows at this stage in their life, and suddenly their portfolio has dropped by 30 or 20% because of the situation we find ourselves in. So with the portfolio size having shrunk, the ability to fund the outflow suddenly becomes in doubt. And that is one category of people who find themselves in a bit of financial distress right now. The second category of people are those for whom inflows themselves have changed. So either due to the company saying we should all take a pay cut to help us go through this, or certain people being made redundant, or if you're a freelancer, then suddenly finding that there isn't really that much of work available right now. And due to all of these, or one of these reasons, you find that your steady cash inflows that you're used to suddenly has become quite disrupted. We would advise that if you find yourself in any of these situations, to take pause really, because often the gut reaction to do something may not be the best thing to do. We would recommend that what you should do right now is to take stock, really identify your asset portfolio and identify the best sources of liquidity. So if you wanted that money, what is the best place from which you can get it? Is it from within your portfolio? Are there other options that you can consider? And that's what I meant by saying consider both assets and liabilities. And if you find that taking on loans is either not possible or not readily available right now, and you really need to look at your assets and find out how you can start to draw down on them, then we suggest that the best way to do that would be evaluate all of your assets on the basis of the risk that they are exposed to, the return that they can potentially deliver, what kind of liquidity they have, and what is the tax impact of potentially taking your money out. And the combination of all of these four factors, each of which is very important, will help you prioritize and decide where is the best place to start taking your money out from. And of course, you can work with a financial advisor who can handhold you through this journey. But that would probably be a good way to go about it. the best approach to take is to go through this journey having a slightly more philosophical approach to things, saying that, this shall pass, this is the temporary disruption, and, once this we recover, then life will go on as usual. Market volatility, as I've said here, is a given in the short term. And one thing that we find is very useful to bring a sense of calmness in the way you look at this is to keep in mind that most of us are traveling a journey that is not measured in days and months or years, but in decades. For most of us, we are looking at, being anywhere from 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years old and expecting to live 80 or 90 or 100 years. And, our money needs to be our journey partner throughout that entire phase. So it's really the number of decades that you have to plan for that is relevant. What happens in a month or two, what happens in a few quarters isn't really that significant when your journey is that long. So having that context or framework within which to look at things will help you in knowing that, while this may seem very disruptive right now, it will also pass. And if you were 80 years old and looking back at your journey, you'll remember this, but you won't remember it with a great deal of horror. It'll be an interesting story to share with your grandchildren. So, to have that belief, to have that idea that this is actually a long journey and little speed bump along the way would help in getting you to that state of calmness that we recommend that you approach this situation with. And then we have the third category of people, which are really opportunists. And there are two camps here. There's one camp which is markets have fallen, the markets have corrected. This is a great time to actually jump in and buy. Why don't we go ahead and accumulate some assets because the prices are very cheap? It's a discount sale where the discount is on the Sensex and it's a 30% discount. So why wouldn't you buy? So that's one school of thought where people are saying things are very attractive. Why don't I jump in and invest in a serious way? The second school of thought is that, this is just the beginning. We are not even at the bottom. We are not even near the bottom. There seems to be substantial downside from here because, the cases are still peaking. People are still falling sick. So there's still a long way to go down from here. So why don't I exit now? And then I know when the bottom will be found. And as soon as the bottom is found, I'll jump back completely and, take advantage of that move. In both of these cases, I would suggest that there is an element of market timing that you're trying to do. And quite frankly, it has been well established around the world that market timing is something that eludes almost everybody. There is nobody who has been able to do it consistently enough that we can say that this is not luck, it is skill. And they are able to consistently do that. So a little later in the document, I'll be talking to you about asset allocation. And that's really what I would advise to the opportunists that are out there who are looking to jump in with a significant chunk of money because the prices are cheap, or those who want to exit now and jump back in later after the market bottoms. So if you're opportunists, it's an interesting place to be, but it's important that you approach the opportunity because there definitely is an opportunity, but it's important you approach that opportunity with a sense of clarity of purpose and a goal that you can work with. And finally, through sessions like we are doing today, we do spend a lot of our time doing investor education, and it has been very satisfying as a thing to do for us, and it's something that we are committed to engage with us. If you have any further questions, please do drop us a line and we'd be very happy to engage with you as well. Take care and have a good weekend and stay home and stay safe.